Thank you for joining us today. I'm Rick Peters, president of the Boston Medical Library, and I would like to welcome you to this hybrid presentation of our 22nd annual Estes lecture. The Boston Medical Library has been involved in the study of medical history from early times to the present, basically its entire history. We have especially focused on the history of medicine in Europe from the Middle Ages and in Massachusetts from 1600s to the present. J. Worth Estes was a professor. Can you advance the slides, please? J. Worth Estes was a professor of pharmacology at Boston University School of Medicine, as well as an accomplished medical historian. He served as editor of the Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences. He wrote several medical history books and numerous articles, and he was very committed to the Boston Medical Library. This lecture was established to honor his memory. I'd like to thank next slide, please. I'd like to thank my colleagues on the Estes Selection Committee for their help in developing ideas for this lecture. And I would also especially like to thank the committee chair, Dr. DiMaria, for his work in organizing this program. Dr. DiMaria will introduce tonight's speaker. Al?
Thank you, Rick. And it's a perk of being the chair of the Estes Committee to get to introduce the speaker. And it's a particular pleasure and privilege tonight to introduce Dr. Perri Klass, who is a professor of journalism and pediatrics at New York University and the medical director of Reach Out and Read, an amazing, now very large program that provides books that are presented to parents as part of regular pediatric care and helps with literacy and helps to instruct parents on how to read to their children and use books. Dr. Klass graduated got an undergraduate degree from Harvard, went to Harvard Medical School with a short period of dabbling in evolutionary biology. I put that in there for my wife. And did her pediatric training at Children's Hospital and then at Boston City Hospital in pediatric infectious diseases. She continues a long history of great medical writers and has written fiction, nonfiction, opinion, a variety of different areas, including a book about being a medical student and a not entirely benign procedure, as well as a book about being training as a pediatrician. She writes about the doctor-patient relationship. She writes about pediatrics. She writes about history, and she writes fiction, as I said, short stories and novels. But pertinent tonight, she wrote a book called A Good Time to Be Born, which I think is a topic that is, I think, very instructional for the time we live in terms of progress. And so without further ado, Dr. Klass.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the hospitality. Thank you for the honor. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been a pleasure to hear a little bit about Dr. Estes. It's a pleasure to be with people who care so much about medical history. And I think maybe I should tell you how I came to write this book, since I am not a historian. I'm a pediatrician. I've done primary care pediatrics. I've done pediatric ID. But one of the things I found myself doing over the last 10 years was teaching an undergraduate course at New York University. It's a core course that's supposed to be on big ideas and interdisciplinary to expose undergraduates to different disciplines. And I was teaching it together with my husband, who's a historian who has written about the history of childhood. And we developed a course on children and childhood in which he would do the historical perspective and I would talk about biology and medicine and some of the constants. And as we talked, year after year to undergraduates about the history of childhood, I would notice that almost parenthetically in things that we read, the author would comment, of course, at that time, more than a third of all the babies born died. Or you'd be reading about somebody famous, and again, almost parenthetically, they had 4 children, 2 of whom died in the first year of life. And I think I had a bunch of pediatric reactions of died of what and how. And I began to think about what it meant that, as I will show you, and as you know, that through almost all of human history, childhood death was very much it was a part of every medical practice, anyone who took care of children. It was a part of everyone's experience of parenthood, and it was a part of family life. And I got more and more interested in this question or in thinking about that. I'm pressing this and I'm trying to, okay, there, nothing to disclose. Okay, and as I was working on this book, this was the graph that hung on my wall and danced in my head at night. And it's from the Centers for Disease Control, and what it shows you is the infant mortality rate. We all know what that means. It means out of every 1,000 babies born alive, how many don't make it to their first birthday, how many die in the first year of life. And it shows you that across most of the 20th century, starting around 1915, 1920. And the reason it doesn't start further back than that is that nobody was counting, right? It's a quotient. It's the number of deaths in the first year of life out of every 1,000 babies born alive. So you have to count every baby born alive. And that's not happening across the United States until we get a couple of decades into the 20th century. And then you can see that there at the beginning, into 1920s, which is not far away in personal history. That is to say, the 1920s is the decade that both of my grandmothers, pregnant with my mother and my father, were wandering around the tenements of New York City. Okay, it's the generation in which my parents were born. You can see that at that point, you're losing in the first year of life about 100 out of every 1,000 babies born in the first year, 1 out of 10. Now, that doesn't tell you who's gonna die of diarrhea at the age of 18 months when it's time to wean. It doesn't tell you who's gonna die later on of diphtheria or polio or accidents. It's just the first year of life, but you can see that as medical graphs go, it's pretty dramatic what happens across the 20th century until, say, the 1980s at the far right of the graph, which is when I was training in pediatrics. And you can see that the pediatric world that we were training in the 1980s, that first year of life looked very, very different than it had looked to my grandmother's. And what you have to wrap your mind around is that all through human history, all through those centuries and millennia, overall in the first 5 years of life, you're probably losing about 40% of the children born. And that is first 5 years of life. So now we're counting diarrhea and diphtheria and all those other things. First 5 years of life, you're losing more than 30%, more than a third, probably into the 40%. And that's pretty much everywhere in the world. And that's going on until we get into the late 18th, 19th century when it starts to drop. And then that 20th century that we're gonna come back to. And what you're looking at here is the preface to a book that came out at the beginning of the new millennium, 2000, from the National Academies of Medicine, called When Children Die, which was meant to be a handbook for palliative and end-of-life care in children. And it's a very good book. But this book, which is about how to manage when children are dying, says on page 1, although dying is a part of life, a child's death in a very real sense is unnatural. And what I want to talk about and what I want us all to think about is what it takes to go from a world in which 40% of the children are dying from the age of 5 to a world where you can say that childhood death should be unnatural, that it's the exception, not the rule. And I'll show you one other news headline. This was from the first summer of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the director of the CDC was testifying before Congress and was asked about the disease not being so serious in children, and that only some relatively few hundred children had died. And her response, which was described as passionate in every headline, was, "Children are not supposed to die." And that we live and train and teach and practice in a world in which we can say children are not supposed to die puts us in a very remarkable historical position. And I would take us back then a little bit. One of the things, we always say in pediatrics, that one of the problems is the children don't vote. Okay, well, if you look back into history, it's hard to find the voices of children. Children are generally not writing the accounts. They're generally not being quoted. And if you're actually looking back for children who didn't live to grow up, they're hard to see, but you find them around the edges, and you begin to get a sense both of who the children were and also of, well, we were just talking earlier, was, were parents somehow protected, their emotions, their feelings? Did they have a greater distance? So this is little Penelope Boothby, who's the daughter of a very, very wealthy British aristocrat at the end of the 18th century. He is a capital R romantic. That is to say, he's interested in romantic poetry. He's interested in children, and he has Sir Joshua Reynolds, the most important portrait painter of the aristocracy at that moment, paint a picture of his 3-year-old daughter, Penelope. He wants her painting. He wants to remember her as a 3-year-old. And you can see that she's painted outdoors. She's painted in nature. He's a romantic. Is nature friendly? Is nature threatening? You can see that the painter is interested in her personality. So that's Penelope Boothby when she's 3, and then a couple of years later, she dies. And her father, the endlessly wealthy aristocrat, hires another painter to paint this painting in which she is being carried up to heaven by an angel. So that he can think about what happened to her. But most famously, as a monument, he asks that a life-size figure be carved for her tomb out of the finest white Carrara marble, Michelangelo's marble, and that it show her not formally posed with her arms crossed on her chest, but as if she is only sleeping. And again, if you go back looking for evidence of how people felt about the children who died, about the marks that they left in their families, and you think about the scale on which this was happening. So I'm showing you three maps of the world here. The first one, the top one, is 1800. Okay, and what you're basically seeing is the same thing I showed you on that graph. Everywhere in the world, children by the age of 5, 40% of them die. Doesn't matter where you are, there's not much variation. And the statistics are broad, but as far as we know, that was just a fact of life. But if we fast forward to the middle one, that's 1950, so that's a few years before I'm born. Okay, look. There are parts of the world, the green parts, where they've driven down under 5 mortality. Instead of it being 40%, it's 4% or 5%. But you're now looking at a glaringly unequal world because there are parts of the world where it's still 40%. So you're seeing in 1950 incredibly dramatic differences between the countries where only 4 out of every 1,000, or only 4%, of the children are dying by 5, and countries where it's still 38, 40%. And then on the bottom, you're looking at 2015, and you can see 2 things. The parts of the world that have driven under 5 mortality down, now they're past 4% or 5%. It's less than 1%. It's 0.7%, 0.6% under 5 mortality. It's unimaginably low if you started at 40%. But you'll also notice that although the world is not absolutely equalized, there's been progress. You're not seeing those same glaring, dramatic, impossible inequalities. You're seeing progress everywhere in terms of the number of children who are dying by the age of 5. I was going to offer you a few samples and quotes from a world in which no matter who you are, no matter who you know, children die. This one is from 1630. It's from a genre which was called comfort books. This is Renaissance England, and as you can see from the spelling. And a comfort book is usually in the form of a letter from a parent who has lost a child, writing to other parents to offer comfort. And you can see it starts with a recitation of the dangers. Some are suffocated in the womb, crushed to death in the birth canal, snatched away in the cradle, mowed off in the May of youth. Okay, that's the recitation of the dangers, but here's the comfort. A great duke or prince lends you a dainty, sweet picture of exquisite workmanship to delight your eyes withal. Are you going to pout and sniff and take on as if you're injured when after a few years' use, he demands it back from you so that he can place it again among the ornaments of his gallery? That's the comfort. The comfort is your child was only lent to you. You had this child because the deity lent you that child, doesn't belong to you. The deity can take it back at any point, and you should not be pouting or sniffing or thinking that you're injured. This is a poem which was a very beloved poem by the Massachusetts poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, which he wrote on the occasion of his daughter Fanny's death. And that's her tombstone you see there. She died at under 2 as a toddler. And the poem begins, "There is no flock, however watched and tended, but one dead lamb is there. There is no fireside, howsoe'er defended, but has one vacant chair." And we know he loved his daughter, and he wrote about how much he missed her and how he longed to see her again. We know that her mother wrote about how every room in the house recalled her. We know they were heartbroken, but what he had to offer was resignation, because there is no fireside without that vacant chair. And then my other example is from the letters of Charles Dickens, who had 10 children with his wife, Catherine, and she was away at a spa taking a cure when suddenly the little baby, Dora, Dickens had a habit of naming his children for his characters, when suddenly their little baby, Dora, developed convulsions and died. And Dickens, who liked serial novels and continued stories, decided to break it to his wife by degrees. So he wrote to her first that the baby was sick. He wrote to her, "Little Dora, without being in the least pain, is suddenly stricken ill. She awoke out of a sleep and was seen in one moment to be very ill. Mind, I will not deceive you." He's deceiving her. Baby died. "I will not deceive you. I think her very ill." But here's the point. Here's what he wants to tell his wife, knowing that he's going to have to break this news. "Remember what I have often told you, that we never can expect to be exempt as to our many children from the afflictions of other parents. And that if when you come, I should even have to say to you, our little baby is dead, you are to do your duty to the rest." But so think about that idea that you can't expect to be exempt, that part of being a parent, however famous, however prosperous, however well connected you are, a part of parenthood is being prepared for the death of a child. This is another Victorian piece of art that was very successful, a painting of a doctor a doctor by the side of a sleeping sick child. And if you look in the background here, you'll see the parents. The mother has her head down on the desk, maybe the table, maybe she's praying, maybe she's crying. Father has his hand on her shoulder. Here's the doctor. Now, the painter who painted this had lost his own small child, his own small son, a couple of years before he painted it. And he wrote that if you look in the background and you see the sun coming up through the window and you see the light, the message of the painting is that the doctor has stayed awake all night and has fought death back, and that unlike his own son, the child in this painting is going to live. So this is the first century of US presidents, and we will call this, for the public health people in the room, we will call this a convenience sample of rich, powerful, well-connected white men. Okay, these are the first presidents going from Washington as far as Lincoln. And what you will see, and to see some of this, you actually have to look at the footnotes or the parentheses in the biographies. You will see that every single one of them who had biological children lost at least one, some more than one, some several. That every single president who had children lost a child in that first century. John Quincy Adams, who was the son of one US president and then would later in his life be president himself, spent some years as the United States ambassador to Russia. And he was in St. Petersburg in 1812, and here he is writing to Abigail Adams, his mother, and he says, "My dearly beloved mother," this is from the ambassador's residence, "we have lost our dear and only daughter, as lovely and promising a child as ever was taken from the hopes of the fondest parent. She had been until a full year old in general healthier than any of our other children were at the same period of their lives. She had already 6 teeth. But she sickened on breeding 5 or 6 at once very soon after being weaned. In other words, she was getting teeth. They decide to wean her, so she's drinking whatever's in the local water or the local milk. And what happens? She develops diarrhea. She developed violent dysentery. And then she developed convulsions. In other words, she gets diarrhea, she gets dehydrated, she seizes, and she dies. She dies of something which, anyone who practices common primary care pediatrics knows, recognizes, thinks about, worries about. She dies because she drinks something which contains a virus or bacteria. She gets diarrhea, she dehydrates, she dies. So I'm not going to belabor this because I know this is an audience. You'll know this. You understand that infant mortality we calculate as a quotient, the number of children who die by the first birthday out of every 1,000 children born alive. We can calculate an under 5 mortality rate in the same way. And these are just some recent numbers. In 2019, the global under 5 mortality rate was 38. Which was down from 93 in 1990. So there had been a lot of progress from 1990 to 2019, although not as much progress as, say, the Millennium Goals had laid out. In 2019, that means 5.2 million children around the world died before the age of 5. But if you look at the breakdown, you'll see that most of those children died in the first year of life, and that most of those children died in the first month of life. So not only has the under 5 mortality been reduced, but around the world, you're seeing something very like what you see in the picture in wealthier nations. For example, in the United States, in 2018, the under 5 mortality rate is 6.9, and out of that, the infant mortality is 5.7, and the neonatal mortality, the first month of life, is 4. So most of it is the first year of life, and most of that is neonatal, perinatal, first month of life. And again, that's part of what's behind this graph, part of what we're thinking about when we think about what happened across the 20th century. This is under 5 mortality in the United States, starting in the middle of the 20th century and continuing into the new millennium. And again, the numbers are lower, but it's pretty dramatic. It's pretty different to be either a parent or a doctor thinking about the likelihood of childhood death back at the beginning, around when I was born, versus when I was training. Now, I know you know this, but we also need to point out that the infant mortality rate is not uniform, that we don't have just one infant mortality rate, that the likelihood of a child dying in the first year of life is twice as high in the Black population, that you can break it down much more, and you have to break it down much more carefully if you really want to know what's going on. And here you see it again broken down not just by racial and ethnic groups, but by when the mortality occurs, whether it is in the first hours of life, the first week, the first month of life. But the point about the disparities is that while the absolute mortality rates have come down dramatically in every group, they've come down very dramatically in the Black population, very dramatically in the white population, but the ratio has not changed, and the disparity has even widened rather than improving. I sorry to turn my back on you, but if you're, this is the infant mortality rate in Black population in the United States starting in 1915 and across to 2017. This in the white population also coming down, but this is the Black to white ratio here, and it does not come down, and in fact, it gets worse. And then the last thing, which I would just say about where we are today, is in recent years, for the first time in decades, we've seen increases in the infant mortality rate in this country. And that's worrisome, and it's worrisome for all of the reasons which you all understand. We use infant and child mortality nowadays as a way to get a snapshot, look at how a country is doing with some of its most vulnerable citizens, look at what kinds of care is being provided. That's where we are now. Go back into history. I just want to make one other comment, which is that we'll start with the idea that there was no safety. It's always been better to be rich than to be poor. It's always been better to be powerful than to be powerless. But here you have the richest man in history, John D. Rockefeller Sr., the first billionaire, who founds the Rockefeller Institute because at the beginning of the 20th century, his beloved namesake grandson, also John D. Rockefeller, dies of scarlet fever in Chicago. And I'm sure with all of the best doctors in the city standing by helplessly. And one of the reasons he founds the Rockefeller Institute is to try to figure out what's going on and to try to find a way to prevent it. Here, this is Leland Stanford Jr., the son of fabulously wealthy parents. Father was the former governor of California, was a railway baron. They had one son born relatively late in life. He was bright and interested, and he wanted to found museums, and they took him to Europe for the grand tour, and he caught typhoid fever. And they took him from city to city, country to country, looking for a doctor who could treat him. And he died in the most elegant hotel in Florence with people putting straw down on the street outside so that the passing carriages wouldn't disturb him. So that was the first thing I wanted to say, was that there was no safety. There were being very, very wealthy did not protect you, did not protect your children. And we see the institutions now, which some of those families founded because they had no child to inherit the fortune. Okay, now I want to talk about a subject I've already touched on that comes up a lot in pediatrics, which is that infant diarrhea and the vulnerability of very small bodies to dehydration and electrolyte disturbances. And cholera infantum was the 19th century term for infant diarrhea. It wasn't cholera. Cholera was a specific entity, but cholera infantum meant summer diarrhea. Why summer diarrhea? Because things spoil in the summer. There are more flies in the summer. Children got gastrointestinal infections year round, but in the summer it was really intense. And I'm showing you one statistic More than a quarter of the children born in the civilized world of the second half of the 19th century died before their fifth birthday, and nearly one half of those deaths were caused by the summer diarrhea. It was a predictable plague if you were a parent, if you were a doctor. And one of the things I want to do in this talk is mention some of the people who turn up when you read this history. And so Dr. Rebecca Davis Lee Crumpler, who's the first Black woman to earn a medical degree in the United States, is someone who is actually claimed by BU. She's born in 1831 in Delaware. She works with some doctors in Charlestown, and they recommend her to the New England Female Medical College, where we know she encounters a certain amount of racial prejudice, but she finishes on time in 4 years with a degree of doctorate in medicine. She's the first Black woman to earn a medical degree in the US, and she has a really, really interesting practice history. She also, by the way, I should have said this, none of these are pictures of Rebecca Crumpler. They're all pictures that I found on the internet when I Googled her. They're random pictures we don't have a picture of her. There's no photo that we think, I wanted to put a photo of her in my book, and there isn't one. But there were all these random photos on the internet, which people said were Dr. Crumpler. So what I used instead was the title page of her book. In 1883, she publishes a 2-volume book of medical discourses in which she talks about what she's learned in her practice, and she dedicates it to mothers, nurses, and all who may desire to mitigate the afflictions of the human race. And as I say, she has a totally fascinating practice history. She practices in British Canada. After the Civil War, she has the chance to go to Richmond, Virginia, and practice in a population of recently enslaved people after the Civil War, so she does that. Then she comes back to Boston, and she practices out of her house on Beacon Hill, entered into the work with renewed vigor. She writes, receiving children in the house for treatment regardless in a measure of remuneration. And her voice comes through so strongly in this book of medical discourses. I've made the pilgrimage. This is the house on Beacon Hill. It's right around the corner from the African Meeting House. But so here she is writing about this entity in her book, this incredibly common thing that happens every summer. And she describes it vividly. A child may be nursing at the breast or feeding from a bottle when all of a sudden it leaves off and looks languidly about in a comparatively stupid and pitiful manner. The eyes lose their luster, are rolled about as if not noticing any particular object. Fluids are thrown up as soon as swallowed. Passages from the bowels are frequent, though many times but a speck in the center of a wet napkin, most of the report being wind. Okay, remember that when she's writing this, nobody knows what causes this disease, which strikes children, which kills children. This is and of course, as often happens when nobody knows, it's blamed on the parents. This is a textbook of the time saying one of the chief causes of this disease is doubtless, it's miasma moment, right? Bad smells cause disease. Residence in an atmosphere loaded with noxious vapors. An atmosphere rendered impure by overcrowding and by personal and domiciliary uncleanliness. It is therefore much more common in tenement houses and parts of the city occupied by the poor than in cleaner and less crowded streets and apartments. That's not true. I mean, I just read you the story of it happening in the ambassador's residence in St. Petersburg. It is true that when families are crowded together in tenements, you see very clearly how many children are dying, and that these families have less ability to buy fresh food and provide for their children. Anyway, this is Dr. Crumpler on the causes of cholera infantum. I love this quote. It's causes and prevention of cholera infantum. It has been argued, authoritatively no doubt, that the causes of cholera infantum are poor milk, bad air arising from old water-soaked cellars of tenement houses, or when it affects those of all conditions in life, the rich, the poor, the black, and the white, then its cause is said to be in some atmospherical phenomena. But what I want to say to you is that when you read this chapter, you see that she's taking care of these children again and again and again, and nobody really knows what's killing them. And when she writes her chapter on general treatment of infants, the chapter begins, children are given to parents only for a lifetime. It may be long or it may be very short. And one of the things that I thought about a lot writing this was not just the experience of being a parent, but the experience of being someone who was trying to care for babies, care for children, with the certain knowledge that life might be very short. Now, shortly after or the book that she wrote, we start to see some of the books which have a lot to do with the need to take on child poverty, like How the Other Half Lives by Reese, the book about the tenements of New York, where my grandmothers would be in a couple of decades, in which there are stories and photographs showing you overcrowding, showing you whole families working in their apartments to make enough money to live on, showing you children sleeping in the street, asking the question, how can this be happening in our cities? And in 1906, a British physician and epidemiologist writes a book called Infant Mortality, A Social Problem, in which here at the beginning of the 20th century, he says, this is not something that we should be blaming on families. This is a social problem. Social problems need social answers. And it's published in England and then brought to the United States. And you start to see in the first decades of the 20th century a movement forming. It's the time when people start counting every baby. So my graph can start. So because we now have statistics on how many babies are born. So this is Dr. Josephine Baker, who is the first, runs the first office, a public health office in the United States, in New York, that is dedicated to the health of children. She's starts out as an assistant commissioner of health for New York City, and then she becomes the first director of the New York City Bureau of Child Hygiene, which is, as I say, the first in the US. And here she is remembering, she writes her memoirs in the 1930s, and she writes, it was an appalling summer, too, with an average of 1,500 babies dying each week in the city. Lean, miserable, wailing little souls carried off wholesale by dysentery. Even New York's worst slums have now forgotten what dysentery epidemics were like, but we knew 30 years ago. So in the summer of 1908, she decides to try an experiment. It's the beginning of the summer diarrhea season. It's going to kill 1,500 babies a week. She's got 30 school nurses because she's put nurses in the New York City public schools to try to bring public health care to the kids in the schools. But it's summer, so the nurses are available. And she decides, as she said, I selected a complicated, filthy, sunless, and stifling nest of apartments, of tenements on the Lower East Side. And she had the nurses visit all the newborns. Nothing revolutionary, just insistence on breastfeeding, efficient ventilation, frequent bathing, the right kind of summer clothes, out-of-door airing. And they found 1,200 fewer deaths in that district than there had been the previous summer. Everywhere else, no change. And here's what she wrote. Remember, she's a doctor. She's a public health doctor. She's the head of the bureau. I had learned one certain thing. Heat did not necessarily kill babies. We had proved that prevention paid far beyond our wildest hopes. There, if we have to be dramatic about it, was the actual beginning of my life work. And right, this is happening before any idea that what you need to do is replacement fluids. This is happening before antibiotics. It's happening with breastfeeding and not overheating the children and some basic hygiene. So these are, again, these are her shock troops. These are the visiting nurses of the Henry Street settlement, dressed to go out and visit. These are the nurses of the Lincoln School for Nurses, which educated Black women to be nurses because many of the nursing schools would not take them. And these women go on to do heroic public health work in New York, in Chicago, in Philadelphia, especially in the Black community where the rates of tuberculosis and infant mortality are very high. And the school continues training nurses well into the 20th century, associated with Lincoln Hospital. This is one of the nurses that they train, Elizabeth Tyler, who actually founds a settlement house further uptown in New York near Columbus Circle and provides health care to the community, works in South Philadelphia. But what I want to show you about Elizabeth Tyler is that when she goes to work in Philadelphia, she's not only doing nursing, she decides to do education. Here she is, this nurse, running a little mother's club for children who care for younger siblings. And you can see she's got a doll. This is another Josephine Baker idea. She's got a doll, and children are learning how to safely take care of a younger child because she said that's who's taking care of the babies in the community where I work. And this is another one of the nurses, Jessie Sleet Scales, who trains in Chicago and who does home visits, especially recruiting Black families with TB into medical treatment. And she writes this wonderful essay in the American Journal of Nursing in which she lists all of the things that she's done. I have visited 41 families, made 156 calls, 9 cases of consumption, 4 cases of peritonitis, 2 cases of chickenpox, 2 cases of cancer, 1 case of diphtheria, 2 cases of heart disease, and so on and on. And again, the voices of the people who are involved in making this change. So, and she lives to be honored late in the 20th century. What I want you to do is I want you to think about what's involved here. Bringing down the infant and child mortality rate, it's not a single campaign. Let's end polio, right? It's not one campaign. It's public health, and it's nursing, and it's sanitation, and it's hygiene, and it's bench research, and it's bacteriology. It's all of these things together. It's a purified milk campaign. Which is very important in the United States in the early 20th century. Nathan Strauss, a millionaire department store owner, makes this his cause, opening milk depots in New York where for very little money you can buy purified milk. Pasteurization is developed in the middle of the 19th century by Louis Pasteur, but he's working on wine and then on beer. It's not till the end of the century that anyone's talking about pasteurizing milk. And then pasteurized milk is very controversial, including among doctors, including among pediatricians. Some people believe that if you boil the milk, the vitamins come out of it. And really what you have to do is inspect the dairy. But there is a campaign. Here you see Chicago Department of Health poster on the long haul, which is the trip that the milk makes from the cow to the train, to the dairy, to the store before it gets to your baby, versus the short haul of breastfeeding. Here you see a famous or even infamous poster also from Chicago saying, "Don't kill your baby," suggesting that you not give the baby beer or coffee, but that pure milk and breast milk are better. And here's another milk depot. And this is the poster from the Year of the Child, 1918. The health of the child is the power of the nation. And the idea that this is something which is everybody's business and it's the future. It's also a little ironic because 1918, of course, is wartime. And one of the other threads that runs through the infant mortality work is, if you look at the posters from France, they're about how Germany's having too many children. We need to have children too, or vice versa. I want to talk about one more disease. Now that I've talked about cholera infantum, I want to tell you a story about diphtheria, which, as you know, is a bacterial infection which affects the throat, and the bacteria make toxin, and the toxin kills tissue, and the tissue can create a plug. It's called a pseudomembrane, which, if you've got a small airway, if you're a child, can actually choke you, can block your airway. Diphtheria is not a disease that I ever worried about. or have ever seen. Myself as a pediatrician, I learned about it from textbooks, but in 1890, it was the 6th leading cause of death in New York, and it was especially dangerous in small children with small airways. And here is a 1912 illustration of a sleeping child and diphtheria coming out to strangle her. So the story I'll tell you 2 diphtheria stories. One is about Abraham Jacobi, who is often described as the father or the founder of American pediatrics. He's the one who actually, we say in pediatrics all the time that children aren't small adults. We're quoting him. He's the one who wrote that pediatrics does not deal with miniature men and women. This is the historic cemetery in Brooklyn where his family has its plot. This is their plot. And he has an interesting life. He's born in Westphalia in Germany. He gets involved with revolutionary activities while he's in medical school. He's arrested as soon as he graduates. He escapes from prison. He's a resourceful fellow. He goes to England to join up with Marx and Engels and make the revolution. According to the story, he wakes Engels up at 4 a.m, banging on the door. Engels describes him as a wild Westphalian, and they decide that he would do better in America. And they send him off to New York, where in fact he becomes the first professor of pediatrics, which is the word that he likes to describe what he does, and founds the first free children's clinic. And he becomes a very distinguished pediatrician. He's incredibly knowledgeable. He publishes vast amounts on all aspects of childhood disease. Here's his own paternal and marital history. He marries. They have a child named Julius, who dies at 1 day of age. Father diagnoses it as meningitis. Then his wife dies, probably from pregnancy complications. Marries a second time. There are 2 stillbirths and then 2 infants who die soon after birth. Again, he makes all the diagnoses. He says they died of debility, which is a word that means weakness, sometimes prematurity. And then second wife dies, again, probably from complications of pregnancy and miscarriage. And then in 1871, here's the obelisk in the family plot, in which Kate is on one side, and each wife is on one side, and then the other side just says the babies. Anyway, his third wife is Dr. Mary Corinna Putnam, a brilliant physician she's the first woman allowed to study medicine at the Sorbonne, in Paris, where they make her use a separate entrance. And after her studies in Paris, she comes back to New York, and she joins the New York Medical Society, which is one of the few medical societies at that point which admits women, which admits Blacks. And the president is Dr. Abraham Jacobi, who makes a point of that we admit qualified doctors. And the 2 doctors get married in 1873. They have a daughter who dies at 1 day of age, and Mary Putnam Jacobi writes to her brother, "I always felt that my first baby would not live. I can scarcely know why, except that a great misfortune so often precedes a great happiness." So even if you're probably the 2 people who between you know more about the illnesses of women and the illnesses of children than any other 2 people in the world. Anyway, they have a son, Ernst, in 1875, and Mary writes to her mother, talking about her husband, "The doctor's happiness in the baby is so intense as to be touching and almost awful." And then they have a daughter, Marjorie, in 1878, and Mary writes, "A baby is not even a boy or a girl, but just a baby, and that is really something wonderful." And among Abraham Jacobi's many publications is an 1880 treatise on diphtheria. He has seen hundreds of cases of this terrible disease, and he writes about all of its many, many, many manifestations. One of the things he writes about is that there's nothing you can do, that you can do a tracheotomy if a child is choking to death, but the results are terrible. He writes, About 200 tracheotomies performed by me brought down the percentage of recoveries to such a low figure that only the utter impossibility of witnessing a child dying from asphyxia has goaded me on to the performance of tracheotomy. So there you have the founder of pediatrics saying to you, I'm doing this bloody operation. I know it doesn't work, but how can you not do it? How can you just stand by and watch a child asphyxiate? And then in 1883, 3 years after he publishes that, both of the Jacobi children get diphtheria, and Marjorie recovers, but Ernst dies at the age of 7 years, 10 months, and 2 days. And his father later on publishes it a year later as a case study. He doesn't say it's his own family. In the family of a physician, there were 2 children. And he comes up with a reason. He thinks that the trusted family nurse, unbeknownst to everyone, perhaps had diphtheria, but people have speculated that perhaps at a moment when the infectious nature of diphtheria was coming to be understood, perhaps Dr. Parents were beginning to have other anxieties about where could the infection have come from. And those are the 2 tombstones, Abraham Jacobi and his son Ernst, in that same family plot. And then before I come to my happy ending, I would tell you about the child of one more child, the child of W.E.B. Du Bois, who the sociologist and the historian coming from Massachusetts, family was then living in Philadelphia. In 1897, he becomes a professor of history and economics at Atlanta University, writes in 1903 in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, about his first son, Burghardt, so sturdy and masterful he grew, so filled with bubbling life. That's Burghardt with his parents. And the most heartbreaking chapter in the book is of the passing of the firstborn. Burghardt gets diphtheria at 18 months in 1899, and there's no white doctor in Atlanta who will treat a Black child, and he dies after 10 days. And it is possible that there's no doctor in Atlanta who actually has the treatment, because in 1890, Burghardt's mother always believed that if they'd stayed in Philadelphia, he would have been saved. And there was serum in Philadelphia. There was serum in New York. There was serum in Berlin. Instead, they carry him back to Great Barrington, Massachusetts to bury him. But what's happened between 1883, when no matter how much medicine you knew, nothing happened, and the end of the century? Well, in 1883, they've identified the bacteria, cultured it, figured it caused the disease, confirmed that it causes the disease. In 1888, they've identified the toxin. And already by 1890, von Behring and Kitasato, and the names give you a sense of how international this is, right? You've got Swiss, Japanese, French. They've developed antitoxins. They've injected first guinea pigs and then horses, which have a lot of serum. And by 1894, they've got an antitoxin and they test it in Paris at one children's hospital. They give it to 448 children with diphtheria at one of the hospitals, and they see that more than half of them recover. And there's another hospital where they don't use it, more than half of them die. And they present this in 1894, and I like to end on this quote because it's probably one of the first great triumphs of bacteriology. Hats were thrown to the ceiling. Grave scientific men arose to their feet and shouted their applause in all the languages of the civilized world. I had never seen, and have never seen since, such an ovation displayed by an audience of scientific men. Thank you.
We have time for questions. People could put them in the chat.
Let's start with some in the group. I guess it can be easier with only 5 minutes. Yeah. Anyone who's not being hold the mic so that. Not question?
This is just sort of a common question on something you talked about. And in terms of all of a sudden at the beginning of the 20th century, there was an interest in doing something about TB. There was an interest in maternal and child health developing. And How much of that do you think was related to the fact that people with the wherewithal to do something about these things recognized that they were at risk, along with people who are more vulnerable and socioeconomically in worse shape? So in other words, there was a move to do something based on risk to them rather than risk to others.
I think that was probably very important. That is to say, when you look at the movement to bring down infant mortality, the Save the Babies movement, some of it is about what's going on in the tenements, but some of it is about what's going on with people that you know. How can you keep your baby safe? And I think there was a commonality of feeling that babies were precarious and that and that turns out to be, if you're going to ask me what the lesson of reading all of this and thinking about this is that you don't make the world safer for children by making your house into a fortress and saying, no danger can come in here. You make the world safer for children, whether it's by, safe, making rules about trying to keep them safe in cars and legislating safety, or by immunizing everyone. You do it, to do it successfully, you do it sort of communally.
We had one request for the reading list, the bibliography for your talk, which I think is probably in your book.
It definitely in the book. I mean,
So is it all right if we post that on?
yeah.
Thank you. We will eventually get that posted. There being no other questions. Oh, Dr. Walsh?
Thank you so much, Perri. That was just a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. So with respect to the antitoxin, were there concerns about the possible dangers of using the antitoxin? I mean, I'm just, reading about the concerns about Salk's polio vaccine, and there was huge hesitancy about that. Was there a comparable problem?
Well, I mean, actually, if you want, I can tell you a little about it. I think I may even have a slide or two here. Let me see. Of course there was. I mean, it's serum sickness is described because this horse serum that you're using has a whole lot of other effects. So people are worried about that. And there's a scandal almost immediately in which there's one batch of diphtheria serum that's actually made from a horse that has tetanus, and a certain number of children die. And from that, we get some of the early legislation, which will go on to be the FDA, that you have to regulate biologics really carefully. That goes all the way back to diphtheria antitoxin. But the other thing that's true is that it's such a scary disease that I'm trying to advance this, but it's not. So they have horses in New York. I'm just wondering. This is I just. This is a vaccination, diphtheria vaccine campaign in the New York public schools, those same school nurses in the 1920s. It's not advancing, should it be? Okay. And there's the dog sleds that bring it to Nome when the port is iced over. But I wanted to leave you with this, which is from the Canadian Public Health Journal of 1927, in which a doctor who was in practice says, "I recall the case of a beautiful girl of 5 or 6 years, the fourth child in a farmer's family to become the victim of diphtheria. It was famous for sweeping through families, killing 2 or 3 siblings. She literally choked to death, remaining conscious to the last moment of life." I felt as did every physician of that day, as if my hands were literally tied. I watched the death of that beautiful child, feeling absolutely helpless to be of any assistance. About 10 years thereafter, my own daughter became ill with diphtheria. And he has an injection of diphtheria antitoxin was given to watch the choking, dreadful membrane melt away and disappear in a few hours with complete restoration to health within a few days was one of the most dramatic and thrilling experiences of my professional career. So I think it's a disease that when children are sick, they're so scared, and to have something to offer matters so much. But yes, as I say, you get this description of serum sickness, you get a lot of medicine and science comes out of that.
Yes.
Yes, right. Yeah, there's a spike in 1918, although again, it's not, that's not the most, babies are not the group that suffers most with the 1918 influenza, but absolutely. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Perri. This lecture will be posted on the BML website, bml.org, within the next week, and we will get the reading list to post with it. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.
Wonderful thing. So look at this, Eric. This is Seward and Anchorage, and the serum went by rail, and then it got hung up with the blizzards and everything frozen, and